24 Hours of PaaS Summit Preview 2018. We're excited you could join us today for Cathrine's session, Biml for Beginners, Script and Automated SSIS Development. This 24-hour of PaaS consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by expert speakers from PaaS community around the world. The session will be recorded and posted online after the event. You will receive an email letting you know when the recording becomes available. My name is Narendra Sharma. I'm a specialist engineer with Commonwealth Bank of Australia and have been working with SQL business intelligence and data warehouse technologies for past 20 years. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Cathrine. If you require technical assistance, please type in your questions in the question pane located on the right side of your screen and someone will assist you. The question pane is also where you may ask questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your question at any time, and once we get to the question and answer portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You'll be able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Please note, there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. This will pop up after the webinar ends in your web browser. I would like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors, Quest. The staging of 24-hour of PaaS would not be possible without their generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. If you would like to learn more about Quest and sign up for information on how they can help you, please visit the sponsor page of 24-hour of PaaS website. PaaS is a global, not-for-profit association where the data professionals connect, share, and learn. Joining PaaS is free and gives you access to hundreds of hours of free online content, live, virtual, and in-person events, the ability to join local groups in your area, an opportunity to attend the annual conferences. PaaS Summit. PaaS is a great way to connect with like-minded professionals, increase your technical expertise, and grow your career. This 24-hour of PaaS session is presented by Cathrine. Cathrine loves teaching, sharing knowledge. She works as a consultant, technical architect, and developer, focusing on data warehousing, business intelligence projects. Her core skills are ETL, SSIS, Biml, and TSQL development. But she enjoys everything from programming to data visualization. Outside of work, she is active in SQL Server and PaaS communities, such as Microsoft Data Platform MVP, Biml Hero, Certified Expert, author, speaker, blogger, organizer, chronic volunteer, and without further ado, here is Cathrine with Biml for Beginners, Script and Automated SSIS Development. Cathrine, here, over to you.
Thank you so much, Narendra, for that lovely introduction and for volunteering here today, helping us presenting these 24 hours of PaaS sessions. So this is my session, Biml for Beginners, Script and Automate SSIS Development. And just a quick note on what's coming up in the session. We have about 45 minutes for the actual content, and we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end to wrap up and answer any questions that you may have. And like Narendra said, just type in those questions in the question pane. He might be able to answer something in the chat. The rest of the questions will be read out aloud at the end. If there's something that I won't get to in our 60-minute time slot, I'll make sure to post that on my blog later. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to cover three main topics. The first one is basic Biml. What is Biml? How does it work? And how does it work with and compare to SSIS? The second topic is tools and code. How do you create Biml projects? What does the syntax look like? And what is this Biml script thing? Finally, we're going to look at how to generate SSIS packages from source metadata. And if that sounds like a bit of a whirlwind tour and a lot of content to cover in 45 minutes, you're absolutely right. But don't worry, the session will be recorded and the demos will be posted online afterwards. I want to start by sharing a little story. This is Sandra. Sandra works as an SSIS developer. Sandra's company is building a new data warehouse, and Sandra has been tasked with creating the staging layer. She has to create over 100 very similar SSIS packages. Now, Sandra's awesome at her job, but she hates repetitive work. She gets quite bored of creating that same package over and over and over again with just small modifications. But she keeps on working until her project is finally finished. Yay! Sandra's excited and she's ready for new challenges. But then Sandra's manager walks in and tells her that, Sandra, you did a great job here, but we just have a few new requirements. And Sandra goes back to work. She keeps on working, but she gets to update every single one of those SSIS packages one more time. Yay. Now, if any of this sounds familiar to you guys, if you've experienced what Sandra just went through here, then you might be ready for a change. And that change is Biml. Biml stands for Business Intelligence Markup Language, and it is an easy to read and write XML language for describing business intelligence objects. Things like your databases, schemas, tables, views, and columns, your SSIS packages, which is what I'm going to cover in the session today, and also more advanced things like SSIS cubes and Azure data factories. Please note that those last things are only available in the license tool, so I will not be covering them today. So hang on, you said that Biml is an XML language. Does that mean I need to learn how to write some code? And the answer to that is yes. And why would you want to go from traditional SSIS development over to using Biml? Why would you want to learn something new and a new way of developing SSIS packages? There are a couple of reasons for that. The main one for me is that when working with traditional SSIS, you spend a lot of time on what I call the plumbing, things like dragging, dropping, connecting, aligning, and switching between different windows in the interface. And with SSIS, you have to define your packages and your templates up front, because once you've created those packages, there's no easy way of applying updates to those packages in an easy way. So it is a lot of manual work, a lot of plumbing. And all of this causes a higher risk of manual errors. If you have to do something manually 100 times, there's a very high chance that 1 or 2 times you might make a little mistake. The final thing with SSIS is that the more packages you have, the more time you spend on developing and maintaining them. Now, moving over to Biml. Biml is a different way of developing SSIS packages. What you do instead of creating each package individually is you create more of a pattern, and then you can generate packages based off of that pattern. And this allows you to handle things like scope and requirement changes very quickly and easily, because you can only update a few lines of code, regenerate all your packages, and that update has been implemented. And this lowers the risk of manual errors. There is the flip side that there is a bit of a learning curve, and it might take you a little longer to get started with Biml. But once you get to the point where you have your patterns, things like your incremental load patterns, your slowly changing dimension patterns, staging patterns, and so on, once you have that, you can just reuse them. So will Biml solve all of your challenges? Short answer to that is no, probably not. Biml is a tool, and just like any other tool, you do need to find the right use cases for you. Biml is a great tool for generating SSIS packages, but it is not a predefined data warehouse framework, and it's also not a tool for automating deployment. So using Biml, you generate packages instead of creating them manually, but after the packages have been created, you still need those processes in place for deployment and enterprise management, and so on. Now, Biml can be part of an automated process like continuous integration and continuous deployment, but it's not a tool that will solve that for you. So how can Biml help you? Biml can be extremely time-saving. Like I mentioned, you create one Biml file with a pattern, and then you can create many SSIS packages from that one file. Biml is also very reusable. You can write your code once and then run it on any platform. And it supports from SQL Server 2005 all the way up to 2017. And this means that if you have a project on an older platform and you want to upgrade that, all you do is regenerate your packages on the right platform, and it will take care of all of that for you. You don't have to migrate the packages and so on. Now, obviously, if you want to use some newer functionality, you do have to implement that in your scripts. And finally, Biml is very flexible. And I highly recommend that you start as simple as possible. Start simple, solving one use case that can help you save a lot of time. A very common example is what I will show you today, which is staging for data warehouse environments, where you can save hours, days, maybe even weeks of development time, and then expand as you learn. You don't have to start with the idea of creating a fully metadata-driven framework for your data warehouse. You can get to that point later. Just start simple, solve something, and then expand as you learn. But hang on, what if I'm not like Sandra? What if I don't have to create 100 similar packages? Maybe you have, very unique packages or just a handful of packages that you need to create and maintain. Is there a way to use Biml if you have that kind of use case? And there are a couple of other things that you can use Biml for that you might not have considered from the start. The first one is source control. If you've ever worked with SSIS and source control, you know that it can be kind of painful, especially if you're working in a team. SSIS and source control don't really play that well together, and if you have two developers working on something at the same time, it's very difficult to merge those changes. In addition to that, when you're working with SSIS and you have the graphical interface, if you move something around, it will actually change the code behind the scenes, meaning that you might check in versions of packages where you haven't made any logic changes. With Biml, it's very different because all of your code, like I mentioned, it's easy to read and write. All of your code describes the logic. So if you change your code, something has actually changed in that package. And since Biml is just XML, it's just plain text, you can use all existing tools for merging and for controlling all of that source. There's also something that is not as common, but you can also use Biml if you have very complex packages. Usually what you hear is using Biml for spinning up hundreds of packages with a very simple pattern like staging, but you can also go in from the complete opposite side. If you have very complex packages with a lot of tasks and a lot of dependencies in there, it can be kind of difficult to keep track of what goes on in the SSIS package. And you have to, if you inherit something from someone else, you have to open up and go through 10, 20, maybe even more tasks. With Biml, it might be easier because you can just look through the code and you can do things like search for keywords, search for column names, and so on. And because Biml takes care of all of that metadata mapping for you in the SSIS, if you do want to change some tasks around, if you've ever done this in SSIS, you might know that changing something and removing and changing some of those precedence constraints, it might break your metadata, and then you have to go through all of those tasks and just reopen them and reload the metadata. You don't have to do that with Biml. So it makes it a lot easier even for complex packages. And finally, there's another use case where you can use Biml instead of dynamic T-SQL to generate all the scripts you need, scripts for creating your tables, for creating stored procedures, complex merge statements, and so on. So there are a couple of use cases for Biml outside of just the traditional SSIS development. But in this session, we will look at SSIS. So just to kind of recap what I mentioned briefly earlier, when you're working with SSIS, it's a very manual process. You have a developer, and that developer creates an SSIS package. You might use that package as a template for creating new packages, but every time you want to create a new package, it's that manual process of creating one in one package. Now compare that to Biml. It works slightly different. You still have a developer, needs to do something, but instead of creating the package itself, they write a Biml file or a Biml script. And once you have that Biml script, you generate all the packages needed. So you can imagine this can be extremely time-saving. So when working with Biml projects, there are a couple of different tools that you can use. The first one is called Biml Express. This is a completely free add-on for Visual Studio. So once you open up your SSDT, once you have this installed, you'll get a couple of new menus that help you develop your Biml projects. And I'll show you this in the first demo coming up very shortly. The other tool is called Biml Studio. This is a licensed tool, you have to pay for it, and it completely replaces Visual Studio. So instead of having an add-in, you have this completely new interface. This again allows you to do more advanced things like working with SSIS cubes, Azure Data Factories, and automating all of your documentation, but you do have to pay for it. So in this session here today, I'm only going to focus on the free tool called Biml Express. Let's take a look at the Biml syntax, and I'm going to show you a few lines of code here, and hopefully when you read that code, you will be able to guess what this does. It's supposed to be easy to read and write, so I'm hoping you can guess this. And if you guess that this piece of code is completely useless, you're absolutely right. This creates two empty packages, so it doesn't really do anything, but it shows you what the syntax looks like. So we start with the root element. This just says that this is a Biml file, and inside of our Biml file, we have different collections of elements. Your collections are the main objects that you work with in Biml, things like packages in this example. It could also be tables, databases, and so on. Inside of those collections, you have the individual elements. In this case, we're creating two SSIS packages, and these elements can have attributes. Some attributes are required. Name is usually required for pretty much every element in Biml. And you can imagine if when you're working with SSIS and you drag something onto the interface, it will give you a default name, Dataflow1, Dataflow2, and so on. In Biml, you don't have that, so you do need to specify the name. The rest of the attributes, some are also required, others are optional. And Biml is a default-based language. If you don't need to override any defaults, you don't need to write the code for it. And this keeps your code as simple and compact as possible. Only write the code if you need to change something. And finally, just a quick note here on the full versus shorthand syntax for elements. On that first line of code, you can see that I end with /package at the end. This allows you to nest child elements inside of that element. And obviously for a package, we want something to happen in there, so we would use that first, the full syntax. If you don't need to have anything inside, if you don't need any child elements, you can use the shorthand syntax and just end with the slash and the bracket, as you can see on the second line of code there. Just saves you another couple of keystrokes, and I'm all about saving time. So let's take a look at how this actually works. I'm going to switch over to my Visual Studio environment, and I will show you how this works. What you can see on the screen now is I have an existing SSIS project open. I actually have a solution with multiple projects in them. So you can see on the right-hand side here, I have a lot of different projects, and all of this will be available for you to download and play around with. I have a lot of demos for all the things I'm going to go through, but in this session today, I'm only going to show you a few demos, and then you can go through that on your own. So once you install Biml, you'll get this little toolbar up here that says Biml Express. And you have a couple of different options there. You can see that you can add a new Biml file. You can add code files, C# and VB, and a couple of other different options here. So once you add a new Biml file, it will be added to the miscellaneous folder in your SSIS project, as you can see on the right-hand side here. And we can start by opening up one of these packages here, and you will see that I have some code in here. And this is very similar to what I showed you in the slide deck, where you have some very simple examples. In this case, I just want to show you that you can create multiple SSIS packages from one Biml file. You just specify each package like this. Then I also want to show you when you start working on adding tasks and adding transformations in your data flow, you will be guided through this process by the IntelliSense. So if I start typing inside my control flow and I start typing a bracket, you'll see that I get this little IntelliSense pop-up here showing me all the different tasks that I can add inside my control flow. And if we scroll down, you will see things like containers and data flows and all the things that we recognize from working with SSIS. Now, if I start typing inside the data flow down here instead, you'll see the same pop-up, but we'll have different options. Now we're looking at all the different transformations that we can have. The audit, the conditional split, custom components even. So anything that you can do in SSIS, you can also do through Biml. Now, once we have this Biml file, what we can do next is to go ahead and actually generate the SSIS package. So if I right-click on this file up here or go through the Biml Express menu, you can see a couple of different options. I can generate the SSIS packages, or I can check Biml for errors. And if you're completely new to Biml, I recommend that you go and check your Biml multiple times during development so you can make sure that everything is good to go. You don't have to debug 1,000 lines of code. So once we have this, we click on Generate SSIS Packages. You'll see down here that the Biml validation completed and this little progress bar showing that it's working on generating those packages. And now we can see in our project, we have our SSIS packages, the 5 empty packages, and the almost empty package. So if I open up this one, just to show you very quickly what this looks like, we have our container with a data flow. So exactly what we specified it to do, we now have that in our almost empty package. So that's the very basics of Biml. I want to show you an example that is a little more complex, so I'll show you some more lines of code. I'm going to go ahead and just delete these SSIS packages because I can just regenerate them at any time. That's the magic of Biml. And let's open up this other package where I want to load a table. And before I show you the code, I want to actually go ahead and generate the SSIS package and open it up and show you what the flow looks like so we can walk through the code together. So I now have this SSIS package called Load Warehouse Colors. Going to open up this one. And I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here. What you can see here in this package is a very simple truncate and load pattern, typical for staging layers and data warehousing. We truncate the destination table, the staging table, then we reload the data from the source, and finally we do some logging. And then inside the data flow, again, we're keeping it very simple here for this demo. I'll zoom out just a little bit again. You can see that we have our source, so we're pulling out the data, we're adding a derived column, we're counting the number of new rows, and finally we're loading the data into our destination. So that's our pattern, that's our truncate and load staging pattern. So let's take a look at what the Biml code looks like for this. I am going to move this over so we can compare this side by side. There we go. So now I'm going to just very quickly walk you through this Biml code. The first thing we have are our different connections. We have 3 OLEDB connections called admin, WWI, and staging. And you can see that these are the same connections that we have in our SSIS package. And over here on the right-hand side, then we just have our connection strings, and that's it. I don't want to scroll back and forth too much in my code here today because I know in webinars it can be a little laggy. So I will just scroll down here into our actual package and walk you through the code. The package is called Load Warehouse Colors, and we have this little option here called Constraint Mode Linear. Now, this linear constraint mode is one of the first things that you'll see when you start working with Biml. There, you can choose between linear or parallel. If you choose linear, that means that all the tasks in the control flow will automatically be mapped up in the order of the code specified, and you'll get these little precedence constraints on success. All of this will be mapped up automatically for you. So if you have simple control flows, just go through tasks in linear order, then choose constraint mode linear. Now, if you want to execute tasks in parallel, you change constraint mode to parallel instead. This allows you to also map all of these precedence constraints manually in case you do need to do some splits, some error handling, and things. I'm keeping it very simple in this demo today, though. Linear is perfect. It saves us even more time. Then we define our variable. We have a variable called new rows, data type N32, and default value 0. And this is similar to going in and looking at the variables in our SSIS package. So we can see down here that we have this variable inside our package. Then we go into our actual tasks. And what you can see here is the first one is the execute SQL task named truncate warehouse colors. We just do a very simple truncate table. Then we go into our data flow with our 4 different transformations. And this is where you see that Biml can be slightly easier to read than going through the SSIS packages manually, because in our code, I can immediately see what happens inside the data flow. In SSIS, however, I need to switch over to the data flow to see all of these tasks. But we can see here that I have my OLEDB source. I add a derived column, and I add a data type date time, and I just pull out the system start time. Then we count the number of new rows into that variable I created previously. And finally, I load the data into the OLEDB destination. Then we close out the transformations and close out the data flow. And now we're back into our control flow with the final task of logging our rows. I'm going to switch back to the control flow. And now we're working on this final task. And if you have execute SQL tasks with parameters, this is probably one of my favorite examples of why I prefer Biml. So if I were to configure this manually in SSIS, I would have to drag it onto the interface, connect it. I would have to open it up and go through all of these little options here. I would have to go and change the connection. Then I would have to open up the SQL statement and use this lovely little interface right here. And then I would have to go over to my parameter mapping. And probably if your interface is anything like mine, you have to go and drag all of these little columns over so you can actually see what's in there, select the parameters from the dropdown, and so on. You just spend a lot of time on that plumbing. It doesn't really add any value, but you still have to go through all the steps. In Biml, however, everything is right here in the code for me to see and read, and it's pretty easy to write as well. So we can see I have my direct input statement up here. Then I have my parameters, map them to variables, and we're done. It's just very, very easy to get an overview of an SSIS package by looking at this code instead of having to go through all of those windows. So that was the basics of Biml, and I'm going to close this out and switch back to my slide deck very quickly. That was the basics of Biml, how to generate a package, how to write some code, and how to kind of compare SSIS and Biml. So what we've seen so far is going from Biml to SSIS. And a question I usually get at this point in my session is, but can we go from SSIS to Biml? Because I already have my existing SSIS project. I already have a lot of packages. I don't want to spend all of that time writing all of that code and going through the IntelliSense and learning all of those things. I just want a starting point. And the answer to that is yes, you can do that. So switching back, I'm going to show you very quickly how it works to reverse engineer SSIS packages. Going back to my Visual Studio environment, and I need to, open up my Solution Explorer again. What I want to do now is on this SSIS package that I now generated from Biml, I'm going to reverse engineer it back into Biml. And it's very easy. I right click and I say convert SSIS packages to Biml. This brings up this little interface here. And you can see that I can choose a couple of different locations. Right now it's picking up that one package that I right clicked on. I can also choose to import all my packages from a DT proj file, ISPack, and even from the SSIS package catalog. But right now, I just want to focus on this one file that I created. There are a couple of different options here as well. I'm just going to leave all the defaults and click on import. Then you'll see the imported assets. So if you have multiple packages, you will be able to just select the one or two that you might want to go ahead and reverse engineer. And you might want to filter out some of those connections. It's completely up to you. I'm going to import everything here and say add to project. When I click this button, it's going to add this bimlscript.biml file for me in my project. And you can see all of the code here that it generated for me. And this is very similar to the Biml code that I wrote by hand previously, but you'll notice there are a couple of differences here. Things like the constraint mode. This one actually chose linear on success, so it's more descriptive than what I had in my code. It includes a couple of things like include in debug dump. Maybe you don't need it. And then all the way down here, it's very similar to what we saw in the code that I wrote. So this is a great way of starting with Biml. If you have an existing project, some existing packages, go through all of that code. Just make sure that you go and read the actual code, because if there's something that you don't need to specify in here, you might want to just go and clean that up so it's easier to read and write. And then again, we can do this in a continuous loop. I can go ahead, right click, and generate the SSIS package again, which will override this one that I had. I'm not going to do that here though. So this is a great way of getting started with Biml. I'm not going to save this code, and I am going to delete this from my project. So that is how you can get started with basic Biml and how you can reverse engineer from SSIS to Biml. And at this point, you might be asking, this looks kind of interesting, but it doesn't really seem like I'm saving a lot of time yet. I would probably be able to spin up that package in SSIS much faster than it would take me to write all of that code. And you're right, we need one more thing to make this really powerful, and that is called Biml scripts. Biml script are little C# or VB code blocks or code nuggets that you can add around your Biml code to actually generate, control, and manipulate that flat Biml code. If you're familiar with things like T4 text templating, even things like ASP.NET, PHP, the way that works with HTML and PHP, for example, you might recognize how Biml and Biml script work together. By using Biml script and writing these little C# code nuggets, and I will just be using C# in my demos. I don't know any VB, so I'll stick to C#. You can do things like importing your database structure and your metadata, and then use that metadata to do things like looping over tables and columns, and for each table create an SSIS package, or for each table create a data flow, completely up to you how you want to structure your packages. And instead of having all of those static hard-coded values, you replace those with expressions that pull out some of that metadata. And so far, what we've seen is with the Biml file, we generate the SSIS packages. Once we start adding on Biml script to our code, we actually have a second layer on top of that. So the first one on the left is our Biml file with some Biml script code nuggets. The first step is that all of those little code nuggets are being parsed and compiled into flat Biml, which you can see in the middle. And then that flat Biml is being used to generate the SSIS packages. And there are a couple of different code blocks that you can add on to your code. And this is where you might start recognizing some of this syntax. The first one is called the control block. It's just a bracket and that pound sign. And anything you put in there is just regular C# or VB code. You can define variables. You can have control logic, such as if-else statements for each loops, and so on. The second one is called the text block, where we add on that little equal sign. Everything that you place inside this text block is being parsed and returned as a string value, just a very simple text value. And these are the little expression blocks that I mentioned earlier, where you can grab bits and pieces of metadata that you might want to insert into your Biml code. The third one is the comment block. This is the one you want to use if you want to disable other Biml script code blocks. There are two types of comments in Biml and Biml script. This one is the Biml script comment. You can also use the standard XML comment where you have the bracket, exclamation mark, dash, dash. That will only comment out the flat Biml. So if you want to disable some other comment blocks, use this Biml comment block instead. Then we have a couple of things that I'm not going to go into in this session here today. The first one of those are directives with the @ sign. This gives instructions to the compiler on how to generate your packages. So you can do things like include external files, reference assemblies if you want to have more advanced code, and so on. And finally, we have the class block with the plus sign. This is where you can create your own C# classes and methods. And again, I'm not going to cover that in this session here today. But since this is 24 hours of PASS Summit Preview Edition, I will point out that all of these things will be presented in my PASS Summit session, where I will do a more advanced Biml session. So if this spikes your interest, come back at PASS Summit and learn more about these things. So to look at the syntax, you might recognize this from what we saw earlier, but we do have a couple of lines of Biml script in here, and I'll walk you through those changes. The first one is that we import the metadata from our source. So on the first line of code, we define a variable called con for our connection, and I say schema manager dot create connection node, and then I pass in the connection string where you see that little ... I've just excluded that from the slide deck because it took up a lot of space. So schema manager is a Biml object that you can talk to, and that will create the connection for you. Once we have that connection, we're going to use it and get the database schema. So on the second line, we create another variable called metadata, and we say connection.getDatabase schema. GetDatabase schema pulls in all the metadata from our source, so everything on our tables, our views, our columns, indexes, keys, data types, all of that is now available in this metadata variable that we can use later on in our code. And then in our package, instead of saying package 1, package 2, package 3, what we're doing now is creating a loop. So what I'm doing here on the first line of code highlighted here, we say for each table in metadata.table nodes, we want to create a package. And then instead of hard coding the name of that package, I'm now using this little text code block and grabbing the name of the table. So the name of the package will be load underscore and then the table name from our source. So just a few lines of code, extremely powerful on how you can actually generate a lot of packages based off of your source metadata. So again, we have our for each loop. That's the first step. We have our Biml script code blocks. That is being parsed and translated into this flat Biml, which spits out all of this code for us. And then finally, we can generate the packages off of that. And this process here, that little step of going from Biml script to flat Biml, is what you can see in the Biml Express preview pane. And this is very powerful. So let's take a look at how that part works. I will switch back to my Visual Studio environment. And I will open up, let's see, our demo here, where we want to load all the tables from a source database. This code here, it's very similar to what I showed you earlier. So we have our connections, we have our simple truncate and load pattern. So I'm not going to go through that, but I will point out the things that are unique since we're adding on these little Biml script code blocks. The first thing you'll see is that these little code blocks are highlighted with yellow, which makes it very easy to see where they're inserted into your code. So at the top here, I create a couple of variables, destination schema, then I create a connection to my source database, and I'm connecting to the database called Wide World Importers, which for those of you who are not familiar is the new AdventureWorks. You'll see it in demos all over. And then I say get database schema. In this case here, I've passed in an import option called exclude views. You can pass in a lot of different filters to this get database schema method. In this case, I'm saying exclude views. I only want to get the table metadata. You can also choose to exclude things like keys and indexes and so on. And you can also pass in filters on which schema and which tables you want to import. So in this case, I'm importing everything, but I could also say only import this specific schema and these 3 tables in that schema, for example. So it's very flexible. And I do have some blog posts going through that in details if you want to dig into that. Scrolling down, we will see our for each loop, where again, like in the slide deck, I say for each table in source metadata.table nodes, create my package. And then I have all of these little Biml script code nuggets down here where I pull out the schema name, the table name, and I use these all over the place. Even things like schema qualified name. And you might be asking yourself, well, what's schema qualified name? And how can I actually see what I'm pulling out here? Once you start working with this, it might not be intuitive what these little code nuggets actually do. And that's where this preview pane it comes in and helps you. So I have this little button down here called Show Preview. When I click on this one, you can see it says Update to View Expanded Biml. So I just go ahead and click Update. And what's happening now behind the scenes is that all of this code is going to go and connect to my database, pull out that metadata, and then replace all of those values for me and spit out the Biml for each of those tables. So what we can see here now is, if I scroll down in this top code, where it said load table.schema.name underscore table.name, we can see that that is actually load application underscore cities. And if I scroll all the way down here, now we have application delivery methods. So we can see all the code that we're actually getting out and using. Same thing for all of these other little code nuggets down here. We can now go ahead and see all of them, including that last one that I showed you, the table.schema qualified name, external table output. You can now see this table here, which is the original name of that table. And we can now see, if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, that we have 1,645 lines of flat Biml code. Obviously, we don't want to write 1,600 lines of code manually, which is why we use Biml script. In Biml script, including all of my white space, it's only about 75 lines of code. So in 75 lines of code, we can generate the packages for all of these tables. So if I now go in and I say generate SSIS packages, it's going to start working the same thing. It's going to go and grab that metadata, create that flat Biml, and then generate the SSIS packages. And this is where I get a drink of water while it's working. And very shortly, we'll see a little pop-up here saying, in addition to 47 new items, the template generated the following items that conflict with existing items. Which of these items would you like to overwrite? And what it's telling me now is, based off of this Biml script that you created, you're going to overwrite a package, and that's the package that we created in the previous demo, the load warehouse colors package. And I know that since I'm now using Biml and I'm not doing anything manually anymore, I can just overwrite that package. If I want to apply some updates, it's the same thing, just overwrite all the packages. So I click on commit, and we will now see in the project that I now have a package for each of my source tables. So I'm not sure exactly how many tables this is, but quite a lot of packages. And my guess is that it would take a fair amount of time to create these packages manually compared to the maybe 15 to 30 seconds or so that we waited for this process to generate the packages. Now we're all done. And this is where Biml is extremely powerful. You can see that with 75 lines of code, that creates all of this flat Biml for you that generates all of these packages. Extremely time saving, especially for use cases like the one I just showed you. So going back into my slide deck here, in the story that I told you earlier with Sandra, if her manager walked in and told her that, you know, we need to add on a new source, or we need to create 200 more packages, so you need to create an entirely new project. Previously, using manual development, she would have to go through that, oh, great, I get to go and create all of those packages over and over again, right? But Sandra now knows Biml, and she replies to her boss, of course I can create 200 SSIS packages. What do you need me to do after lunch? Because it really can be that time saving. So over the past 45 minutes, like I mentioned in the start, this is a bit of a whirlwind tour here. We covered the basics of Biml, what it is, how it works with SSIS, and we compared some code and SSIS side by side. We looked at the different tools that you can use, focusing on Biml Express, which is completely free. And we looked at the code and the syntax for Biml and Biml script. And then finally, we looked at how we can get all of that metadata from a source database and use that to generate all of our packages. So if this sounds interesting, and I know this is quite a lot to cover, and you probably want to go in and get your hands dirty and write some code and learn some more, go to bimlscript.com. What you will see there once you create a little account, you can log in and you'll see this little learning path on your screen. And you start with the very basics and you go through all of these different steps. And if you're not familiar with XML, or if you're not familiar with C#, you have things like an intro to XML module. You also have a C# primer module, which will help you explain all of those concepts that I kind of skimmed over, things like control statements and even more on the syntax in there. So I recommend that you go through this, and the final checkpoint is building an automated staging layer, as you can see. It has a couple of things that I didn't have time to show you in the past 45 minutes, so absolutely go through that learning path. And if this sparked your interest and you want to start learning this, and maybe over the next couple of months you start digging into this and you want to learn even more, again, I do have to refer to the past summit coming up in Seattle in November. There will be 2 sessions focused on Biml. The first one is by one of my personal heroes, Tim Mitchell. He has a 2.5-hour, it's a half-day workshop on building a metadata-driven ETL repository with Biml and SSIS. I'm personally looking forward to that, and I'll be front and center through that session. And then I'm presenting a session as well called Level Up Your Biml Best Practices and Coding Techniques. In that session, I will take it one step further and I will show you even more on how to reuse code across different projects and solutions, how to create C# classes and methods, and so on. So you can continue your learning at Past Summit. Finally, I want to end with some advice based on my experience. The first one is get things done. The main reason for using Biml instead of using traditional SSIS development is because you want to save some time and save some money and deliver as often as you can. So start small, start simple, and start with ugly code. As long as it works, it doesn't matter if you're using this or that kind of code. Just get it to work in the way that works for you. And then keep going. Expand when you need it. Improve it when you need it. Just make sure that you deliver often. That's the whole point of moving over to using Biml. Deliver often and become a more valuable employee. Maybe it'll get you a raise, maybe you'll get a promotion, but either way, get things done, deliver often, and save that time. And hopefully, if you do that, you'll be in the same situation as Sandra, where you can do all of your Biml on Monday and take the rest of the week off on your Biml break because you're saving so much time. Just a little note there, don't tell your boss that you're actually using Biml, so you can take all of those days off. That was it for me here today. You can go to my website or to the 24 Hours of Past website to download the slide deck. And on my website, you can also download all of the demo code that I showed you, including all of those other projects, so you can go through everything at your own pace. If you have any questions, we have about 5 to 10 minutes now at the end for any questions. If you think of anything afterwards or you're watching the recording of this session, feel free to email me or reach out on Twitter and I'll be happy to help you. So I will check with Narinder and see if we have any questions. I can see that he's answered a couple of things in the chat already.
Thank you very much, Cathrine. Yes, the event session has attracted lots of interest, and I can see participants are quite active. People have been asking questions, and I'll take some of the interesting ones with you. The first question is about reverse engineering, where a participant wants to know, yes, you've shown us how to reverse engineer a project, is spec file, and so on. But is there a way where we can generate multiple packages, reverse engineer multiple packages at the same time?
Yes, so you would use that same interface, and in this case, I only had one package in there, but you will see multiple packages if you import an entire project. And what will happen is that in that bimlscript.biml file that it generates for you, you will see one piece of code for each package that you reverse engineer. So if you have 10 very different packages, you'll get maybe 500 or 1,000 lines of Biml code in there. And then you can go through and you may have to do some little code tweaking there. You might want to move some of that code into other Biml files, for example. And then obviously the next step after reverse engineering is, because it's only generating that flat Biml, you might want to start looking at how to change all of those hard-coded values and use Biml script so you can do it more dynamically the next time. But yes, it can reverse engineer multiple packages. You will just get multiple elements in that one Biml file.
Wow, that's fantastic. Because when I started with Biml using Bits Helper, it was very, very basic. And since the advent of Biml Express, things have become very, very easy. Next question is
Yes, I absolutely
about
agree.
Yeah. Next question is around the XML. Not everyone is as familiar with XML, and some people are more comfortable with different type of formats, for example, JSON. Is it possible to use JSON instead of XML? That's another question.
No, it's not. Biml is based on XML. You can see they both have the ML at the end of their name there. So Biml is an XML-based language, and you will have to learn that. They've made it as hopefully as not as painful as you might think it would be, because you can do things like reverse engineering, and you
Um,
get help.
so, thank you. One of the participants wants to know which version of Biml were you using? Were you using Biml
From that
Express,
intelligence.
Express or
But
Studio?
unfortunately, Biml is only language right now. I was using Biml Express. And a quick note on that, I'm using the version called Biml Express 2018, which will be released very shortly. When we're recording this, it's still in public preview, but it should be released very shortly this summer.
All right. Because one of the participants feels that his Biml Express looks very different from yours. That's why now we know the secret.
Yep.
So about the XML, so one of the participants wishes to know if instead of hand coding XML, is there a way like they can use some external XML editor? If so, which one would you suggest?
So there are a couple of different answers to that. The first one is obviously look into using Biml script to generate as much of that XML as possible. 75 lines of Biml script code can generate thousands of lines of flat Biml, so you don't have to write that. The other is the XML itself. You do have to use the Biml Express editor when you're working with SSIS in terms of actually generating the packages, because it is integrated into Visual Studio or into SSDT to work with the SSIS engine. But you can absolutely use things like other editors that might help you speed up your time by using Notepad++ or Visual Studio Code, because you're only working on XML files. And that first line of code, that Biml, it actually defines the XML namespace, and that will give you the IntelliSense in other editors as well. In terms of looking at help getting into XML, I would actually have to Google that to see if there are any tools that will help you write the code itself. I've just used Biml Express and used that add-on because it is super helpful with that IntelliSense.
Thank you very much. That's a brilliant answer. One of the participants have asked, why do I use Biml than Databricks? What is the advantage of using one over the other?
Oh, so Biml versus Databricks, two completely different products. The question there is actually, why would you use SSIS instead of Databricks? There are two different ways of doing ETL. They both have their pros and cons, and that answer is probably a little more complex than we have time for here. But just to summarize what I mentioned in my slide deck, Biml is a way of scripting and automating SSIS development. So if you want to compare something, you need to compare SSIS to Databricks. They work in different ways, two different tools for using ETL, and maybe you would prefer using Databricks, or maybe you want to use a completely different tool, in which case Biml is not going to help you as much. So you need to look into the pros and cons and the differences of using SSIS, which is more of an on-premises solution, compared to Databricks, which is a cloud-only solution.
Oh, wow. Yes, totally. So SSIS packages, they can be very complex, as you know, and sometimes they include script tasks. What happens when you reverse engineer SSIS package that includes VB scripts or C# code as a script task?
I don't have a demo for that, but what happens is that it creates the Biml for the script task itself, and then it just uses all of that code inside that script task and puts that inside your SSIS package. So it works exactly the same way. There's a little more code to get the script tasks working, just a few more lines of Biml code. But like I said, Biml can do anything that SSIS can do. So there's a little more code to go through there to set up that actual script task. But it will be reverse engineered, and all of that code will just be included in your Biml file, so you can then turn it back into SSIS packages. And if you want to look into that into more details, again, go to bimlscript.com. They also have a lot of articles on things like the script task. They link to external blog posts by other Biml heroes and experts on this topic, and then you can use that as kind of a hub and a starting point to go and dig into these details.
Surely, I think there's plenty of documentation, and your blog itself has wealth of information on Biml and Biml related topics, including this all the scripts and demos that you have presented today. Surely, I would highly recommend audiences to go and visit Cathrine's blog. And the question we have here is this Biml optimized? What about the performance? Like when you generate, when you're writing the code, you go ahead and you just make sure that you set how much the commit batch and all those things to make sure that your code run optimally. What about Biml? How does it handled?
Just a quick note, I think this is the last question that I'm going to answer here because we're running short on time. In terms of
Sure.
Biml optimization, what you actually spend time on is pulling out that metadata from your source. So there are a couple of different ways to do that. And the first note is once you pull out all of that metadata, it might take you a couple of minutes to connect to the database and pull that out, but it doesn't really affect your source that much. You don't really need to optimize your Biml script that much. Focus on optimizing your SSIS packages. Those are the ones that will actually load all of that data. So Biml performance, I would actually say, is a non-issue, unless you have thousands of sources that you need to connect to, in which case there are a couple of optimization tricks. Email me if you have any questions on Biml optimization. I have more slides and resources on that, but for most people, you don't even have to worry about Biml performance. Focus on the SSIS performance.
Thank you very, very much, Cathrine. And I hope all the answers have been, audience answers have been answers to their satisfaction. Thank you for your time. And I highly recommend everyone to follow her on Twitter and do visit her blog website. Stay tuned for our next session on improving app performance using async messaging with Service Broker with Alan White. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much, everyone.